At 12:42 p.m., on July the 20th, 1944, a briefcase was set down beneath a heavy oak table inside a wooden conference hut. Outside, the East Prussian forest stood still in the summer heat. Pine needles lay undisturbed. Guards remained at their posts. Nothing, at first glance, suggested that history was about to hinge on the contents of a single leather case. Inside it was an explosive charge powerful enough to kill everyone in the room. The man who placed it there did so with his left hand. His right hand was gone, so was his left eye. He moved with practiced care, masking pain behind discipline. His name was Claus von Stauffenberg, a colonel in the German army, and in that moment he believed he was about to end the Third Reich. For nearly 12 years, Adolf Hitler had ruled Germany through terror, charisma, and absolute loyalty. By the summer of 1944, that rule was beginning to crack. Germany was losing a war it could no longer win. Entire cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. And yet the regime endured. What followed at the Wolf's Lair that day was not merely an assassination attempt. It was the culmination of years of moral conflict, military despair, and political calculation. It was the closest Nazi Germany ever came to overthrowing itself from within. This is the story of Operation Valkyrie. Not as myth, not as legend, but as it unfolded minute by minute, decision by decision, inside a collapsing dictatorship. By 1944, the war had turned decisively against Germany. In the east, the Red Army was advancing with relentless force. Entire German army groups had been destroyed. In June, Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration, annihilating Army Group Center and erasing nearly 300,000 German soldiers from the order of battle. The front that once stretched deep into Soviet territory was now collapsing toward Poland. In the west, the Allies had landed in Normandy. Though fiercely resisted, the invasion could not be pushed back into the sea. Every week, more men, tanks, and aircraft poured into France. Germany was now fighting a two-front war it had neither the manpower nor the resources to sustain. Above the Reich, Allied bombers flew almost unchallenged. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, Berlin, entire districts burned night after night. Firestorms consumed neighborhoods. Civilians slept in cellars and subway tunnels, listening for the rising whine of engines overhead. The promise of victory that had once unified the nation was gone. In its place was exhaustion, fear, and silence. Yet publicly, the regime projected strength. Hitler remained infallible, defeat was forbidden language, doubt was treason. The Gestapo watched closely, letters were opened, conversations overheard, even within families trust eroded. A careless remark could lead to arrest, a joke could mean disappearance. And still, beneath the surface, something began to shift. Among certain officers, administrators, and civilians, the unthinkable was now being spoken quietly behind closed doors. Germany, they believed, could not survive Hitler. Resistance to the Nazi regime did not begin in 1944. From the earliest days of Hitler's rule, there had been opposition, fragmented, isolated, and ruthlessly suppressed. Communists were arrested almost immediately after 1933. Social Democrats followed. Churches resisted state control in sermons and underground networks. Students distributed leaflets. Individuals acted alone, often paying with their lives. But none of these efforts came close to threatening the regime itself. The military, however, was different. The German officer corps had been raised on obedience, hierarchy, and loyalty to the state. Many despised Hitler's vulgarity and distrusted his strategic instincts, yet they swore an oath not to Germany but personally to Adolf Hitler. For years that oath held. Victories reinforced loyalty. Poland fell in weeks, France collapsed in 6. Hitler appeared unstoppable, and opposition seemed both dangerous and unnecessary. But war has a way of stripping away illusion. In the East, officers witnessed mass shootings, scorched earth tactics, and the systematic murder of civilians. Some turned away, others protested quietly. A few concluded that what Germany was doing and what it was becoming could not be allowed to continue. Still, even among critics, the idea of assassination remained taboo. Until defeat made it unavoidable. By 1942, it was becoming clear to senior officers that Hitler's interference was catastrophic. He overruled generals, refused withdrawals, and demanded sacrifices that served ideology rather than strategy. Stalingrad was the breaking point. An entire German army, more than 200,000 men, was encircled and destroyed because Hitler forbade retreat. The shock reverberated through the military. For the first time, Hitler's judgment was openly questioned in private. Plots began to form. Colonel Henning von Tresckow, serving on the Eastern Front, was among the first to conclude that killing Hitler was the only way to save Germany. He attempted multiple assassinations, bombs hidden on aircraft, timed explosives placed near Hitler, all of which failed through chance, malfunction, or sheer bad luck. Each failure tightened security. Each failure increased the personal risk. But the idea no longer seemed unthinkable, it seemed necessary. The problem was not only killing Hitler. It was what came after. The Nazi state was built to survive decapitation. Even without Hitler, the SS, the party, and the security apparatus would remain. Killing the Führer without seizing power would plunge Germany into chaos or worse, civil war. What the conspirators needed was legitimacy, orders, a legal framework that would allow them to act swiftly and decisively in the hours following Hitler's death. Ironically, the solution already existed. It was called Operation Valkyrie. Valkyrie was an emergency plan approved and signed by Hitler himself. It was designed to be activated if foreign laborers, prisoners of war, or internal enemies rose up inside Germany. Under Valkyrie, the reserve army would secure key government buildings, communication centers, and transportation hubs. Martial law would be declared. The SS could be arrested. All of it on paper was perfectly legal. What Tresckow and others realized was that with minor changes, carefully worded orders, forged signatures, Valkyrie could be turned against the regime itself. But to do that, they needed access. And for that, they needed a man close to Hitler. Claus von Stauffenberg was not an obvious candidate. Born into an aristocratic Catholic family, he was cultured, intellectual, and deeply patriotic. Like many officers, he initially welcomed Hitler's rise as a restoration of German dignity after the humiliation of Versailles. He was no Democrat, he was no revolutionary. But the war changed him. In Poland, he saw brutality against civilians. In Russia, extermination. In North Africa, the collapse of German ambition. In 1943, an Allied air attack nearly killed him. When he awoke, his body was shattered, his right hand gone, 2 fingers missing from his left eye destroyed. Many assumed his career was over. Instead, he returned. And with him came a clarity few others possessed. Stauffenberg came to believe that obedience had limits, and that when the state itself became criminal, responsibility fell on the individual. By 1944, he was convinced that killing Hitler was not murder. It was duty. In the months leading up to July, Stauffenberg rose rapidly. Despite his wounds, or perhaps because of his reputation, he was appointed Chief of Staff to the Reserve Army. The position granted him access to Hitler's briefings and to the machinery of Operation Valkyrie itself. For the first time, the conspirators had what they needed. A man close enough to kill Hitler and powerful enough to trigger a coup. Time, however, was running out. The Allies were closing in. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Every week that passed meant more dead soldiers and civilians alike. If they were going to act, it had to be soon. In the forests of East Prussia, the Führer's headquarters waited. And with it, the final chance to change history. By the spring of 1944, the idea of removing Adolf Hitler was no longer confined to whispers or theoretical discussions. It had become a race against time. Germany's defeat was approaching, but how it arrived mattered. To many within the resistance, the difference between collapse and catastrophe lay in whether Hitler lived to the end. If he remained in power, Germany would fight on until its cities were rubble and its people broken. If he were removed, there was at least a chance, however slim, to negotiate, to save lives, and to preserve something of the nation beyond unconditional surrender. This belief bound together a group of men and women who otherwise shared little in common. They were not united by ideology, they were united by urgency. The German resistance was never a single organization. It was a constellation of circles, often unaware of one another, separated by geography, class, and worldview. Some were military officers, others were civil servants, diplomats, theologians, lawyers, or academics. Communication was dangerous, meetings were rare and brief, information traveled through trusted intermediaries, a single careless word could lead to exposure. The Gestapo did not need proof, suspicion was enough. Within the military, opposition was strongest among officers who had seen the war up close. They had watched men die for orders that made no sense. They had witnessed atrocities that violated everything they believed Germany stood for. Colonel Henning von Tresckow, stationed on the Eastern Front, became one of the intellectual centers of resistance. He believed that the officer corps bore responsibility not just for military outcomes, but for the moral direction of the nation. In his view, failure to act was itself a crime. Again and again, Treschow attempted to kill Hitler. In March of 1943, he smuggled an explosive disguised as a gift onto Hitler's aircraft. The bomb failed to detonate. Later attempts were aborted at the last moment due to security changes or chance. After each failure, Treschow refused despair. The assassination must be attempted at all costs, he insisted. Even if it does not succeed, the act must be carried out. To him, resistance was not only about success. It was about proof that not all Germans followed Hitler willingly to the end. In Berlin, a different kind of resistance took shape. Senior officers within the Reserve Army, men like General Friedrich Albrecht, understood that killing Hitler alone would achieve nothing unless power could be seized immediately afterward. They studied emergency regulations, legal precedents, and command structures. Their goal was to transform a moment of chaos into an orderly transfer of authority. Operation Valkyrie became their instrument. Under the original plan, reserve army units across Germany would mobilize to suppress internal unrest. Orders would be issued rapidly, bypassing normal chains of command. Speed and obedience were central to its design. Albrecht and his allies quietly modified these orders. The wording was subtle. Instead of insurgent workers, the enemy became party leaders attempting to exploit the emergency. The SS, once untouchable, could now be arrested for the protection of the Reich. On paper, it all looked legitimate. In reality, it was treason of the highest order. The greatest obstacle remained Hitler himself. Security around the Führer was unpredictable. His schedule changed without notice. Meetings were relocated at the last minute. Physical access was tightly controlled. Many conspirators volunteered to carry out the assassination. Most were rejected. Some lacked access, others lacked the nerve. A few lacked the willingness to accept the moral burden. Killing Hitler meant certain death if the plot failed, not only for the assassin but for their families. It was Claus von Stauffenberg who stepped forward. Unlike others, Stauffenberg possessed a rare combination of access, authority, and resolve. His position placed him inside Hitler's inner military circle. His injuries disarmed suspicion. His aristocratic bearing reassured superiors. Most importantly, he was prepared to act. To those who knew him, Stauffenberg's transformation was striking. Once idealistic, even romantic about Germany's future, he had become coldly focused. He spoke less. When he did, it was with clarity and intensity. He did not expect to survive. As the plan matured, the conspirators faced an uncomfortable truth. They were late. By 1944, Germany's crimes were already immense. Millions had been murdered, entire regions devastated. Even if Hitler were removed, the Allies had little reason to trust any new German government. Some conspirators argued that assassination was meaningless at this stage. Stauffenberg rejected this. For him, action was not measured only by outcome. It was measured by responsibility. If Germany was to have any moral standing after the war, someone had to demonstrate that resistance was possible, even if it came too late to change the result. This conviction drove him forward. The final months before July were filled with tension. Every visit to Hitler's headquarters was a potential opportunity and a potential trap. Stauffenberg carried explosives repeatedly, only to abort the attempt due to unforeseen circumstances. Sometimes Heinrich Himmler was absent, sometimes Hermann Göring. The conspirators wanted to kill as many senior Nazi leaders as possible in one strike to prevent a power struggle. Each delay increased suspicion. Each delay exhausted nerves. But fate refused to align. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside Germany grew darker. Bombing intensified. Refugees flooded westward. Soldiers on leave spoke quietly of defeat, yet public dissent remained rare, not because people believed but because fear still worked. The regime tightened its grip. Special courts handed down death sentences in minutes. Executions were filmed. Loyalty was demanded ever more loudly as confidence eroded. Within this pressure cooker, the resistance understood that hesitation could be fatal. They chose a date. July the 20th. It was not symbolic, it was practical. Stauffenberg was scheduled to attend a briefing at Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, the Wolf's Lair. This time they would not turn back. In the days before the attempt, final preparations were made. Explosives were tested, detonators checked, couriers memorized orders, phone numbers were rehearsed. In Berlin, reserve army units stood ready, unknowingly preparing to arrest the regime they served. The plan depended on a narrow window of time. Hitler had to die, confirmation had to reach Berlin quickly, Valkyrie had to be activated before the SS could react. Minutes would matter. Delays would be fatal. On the evening of July 19th, Stauffenberg said goodbye to his family. He did not tell them what he intended to do. He did not need to. The next morning he boarded a plane for East Prussia. History was about to hinge on chance, courage, and the placement of a single briefcase. Operation Valkyrie was never meant to overthrow a government. It was designed to protect one. In its original form, Valkyrie was a contingency plan, an emergency procedure to be enacted if Germany's vast population of foreign laborers or prisoners of war rose in revolt. Under these circumstances, the regular army would temporarily assume control of internal security. The logic was simple. The SS was powerful but stretched thin. The army, by contrast, maintained units across the Reich, trained for rapid deployment and accustomed to following orders without hesitation. If chaos erupted, Valkyrie would restore order. The plan had been drafted, approved, and signed by Adolf Hitler himself. That signature would later become the conspiracy's greatest weapon. At the center of Valkyrie stood the reserve army. Unlike frontline units, the reserve army operated within Germany. Its responsibilities included training replacements, guarding infrastructure, and maintaining readiness in case of internal emergency. Its commander answered directly to Hitler. This structure allowed orders to bypass regional authorities and SS commands entirely. Once activated, Valkyrie gave the reserve army legal authority to occupy ministries, seize radio stations, control railways, and arrest individuals deemed threats to state security. Everything depended on speed and legitimacy. Orders would be issued in Hitler's name. Most officers would not question them. The conspirators understood this. They also understood the danger. If Hitler survived, Valkyrie could not be used. Any premature move would expose the entire network. Failure meant not only execution, but retaliation against families and associates. The plan therefore hinged on a single moment. The instant Hitler was confirmed dead. Inside the Bendele block in Berlin, the headquarters of the Reserve Army, General Friedrich Albrecht, and his staff prepared their version of Valkyrie. Original documents were altered subtly. Language was adjusted, names were replaced. The SS, once protectors of the Reich, were recast as traitors exploiting the emergency. The revisions were carefully designed to sound routine. Orders were typed, retyped, and memorized. Copies were hidden, messengers were assigned. Nothing was left to chance except the human factor. One of the most critical uncertainties was General Friedrich Fromm. As commander of the Reserve Army, Fromm occupied a position of immense importance. He was aware of the conspiracy but had not committed himself fully. Fromm was cautious, opportunistic, and deeply concerned with self-preservation. He did not oppose Hitler openly, nor did he report the conspirators to the Gestapo. Instead, he waited. If the plot succeeded, he would support it. If it failed, he would deny everything. The conspirators tolerated this ambiguity because they had no alternative. Removing Fromm prematurely would alert the regime. Trusting him was a gamble they could not avoid. Another uncertainty lay in the SS. By 1944, Heinrich Himmler's organization had grown into a state within a state. It controlled police forces, intelligence networks, and concentration camps. Its loyalty to Hitler was absolute. If the SS reacted quickly, Valkyrie would collapse. To prevent this, the conspirators planned to act decisively. SS headquarters would be surrounded, leaders arrested, communications severed. But all of this required that army officers believe they were acting legally. Confusion would be their ally. As Stauffenberg flew east on the morning of July 20th, the machinery of the coup lay dormant, waiting. In his briefcase were 2 explosive charges, British-made plastic explosives smuggled into Germany months earlier. Each was powerful enough to kill everyone in the briefing room. But Stauffenberg faced a severe disadvantage. With only 3 fingers on his left hand, arming the explosives was difficult and slow. The detonators required precise handling. Time was limited. He would have minutes at most. The Wolf's Lair was designed for secrecy and protection. Hidden deep in the forests of East Prussia, it was surrounded by minefields, guard posts, and anti-aircraft batteries. Concrete bunkers housed key personnel. Meetings were held behind layers of security. Visitors were searched repeatedly. Stauffenberg's injuries, however, worked in his favor. Guards were reluctant to inspect him thoroughly. His briefcase passed without scrutiny. Shortly before the briefing, Stauffenberg excused himself to prepare. In a small washroom under pressure and with limited dexterity, he managed to arm only one of the two charges. Time was running out. He closed the briefcase. The briefing was scheduled to take place in an underground bunker, a confined space that would amplify the blast. At the last moment, the location was changed. The summer heat was oppressive, the bunker was stifling, the meeting was moved to a wooden conference hut with open windows. The change was seemingly trivial. In reality, it would determine everything. Inside the hut, Hitler stood at the center of the room, leaning over a large map table. Around him gathered senior officers, aides, and staff. Stauffenberg entered calmly. He placed the briefcase near Hitler's position, beneath the table, as close as he could manage. He then excused himself, citing the need to make a telephone call. No one stopped him. Minutes later, he was gone. As Stauffenberg exited the compound, the fuse burned silently. He passed guards, he reached his vehicle, he drove toward the airfield. At 12:43 p.m., the explosion tore through the briefing hut. The blast killed 4 men instantly. The wooden structure disintegrated, shrapnel flew outward, smoke and debris filled the air. But Adolf Hitler survived. Shielded by the heavy oak table leg and the open structure of the hut, he suffered burns, torn clothing, and temporary deafness, but no fatal injuries. Within minutes, the truth began to spread. The Führer was alive. In Berlin, however, that truth had not yet arrived. Stauffenberg believed he had succeeded. From the airfield, he sent word Hitler was dead. Operation Valkyrie began. Orders were issued, units mobilized, SS officers were arrested in several cities. But hesitation crept in. Confirmations conflicted, phone lines buzzed with rumors, Fromm demanded proof. And then the radio spoke. Adolf Hitler addressed the nation. Alive, defiant, the fragile structure of the coup began to crumble. When Claus von Stauffenberg boarded his aircraft at the Wolf's Lair, he believed Adolf Hitler was dead. The explosion he had seen from a distance was violent. The structure had collapsed. Bodies had been carried from the wreckage. No one he spoke to contradicted his assumption. In the absence of certainty, he chose belief. Belief was enough to set Operation Valkyrie in motion. The flight from East Prussia to Berlin was agonizingly slow. From the air, Germany appeared peaceful, fields, rivers, towns undisturbed by the crisis unfolding within the state. Stauffenberg used the time to rehearse what he would say. Orders had to be issued quickly. Authority had to be asserted without hesitation. There could be no doubt in his voice. In Berlin, the Bendeleblock was tense but still operational. General Friedrich Albrecht had already taken the risk of initiating preliminary Valkyrie orders before official confirmation arrived. Units of the reserve army began to mobilize. Couriers were dispatched. Communication centers were placed on alert. But cracks appeared almost immediately. General Friedrich Fromm refused to act without confirmation of Hitler's death. Phone calls to the Wolf's Lair produced conflicting reports. Some claimed the Führer was dead, others insisted he had survived. The uncertainty was paralyzing. When Stauffenberg arrived in Berlin that afternoon, he did not waste time. He asserted that Hitler was dead. He spoke with absolute conviction. For a moment, it was enough. Valkyrie was activated. Across Berlin and several other cities, army units moved to occupy government buildings, radio stations, and SS offices. SS officers were disarmed and placed under guard, often without resistance. Many believed the orders were legitimate. They followed them. But time was slipping away. The Nazi leadership reacted quickly. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, remained free and in control of key communication channels. Heinrich Himmler began issuing counterorders. Loyalist officers hesitated, waiting to see which side would prevail. At the Bendeleblock, the situation deteriorated. Fromm confronted Stauffenberg directly. He demanded proof. Stauffenberg could offer none. As evening approached, the truth could no longer be contained. Hitler's voice was broadcast over the radio. Though weakened, it was unmistakable. He announced that he had survived an assassination attempt and that the perpetrators would be punished. For officers who had been uncertain, the decision was now clear. Loyalty returned. Orders were reversed. Units stood down. The coup collapsed city by city. Inside the Bendela block, panic spread. Fromm moved quickly to save himself. He arrested Stauffenberg and the other principal conspirators, General Albrecht, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, and Lieutenant Werner von Heefen. Fromm convened a summary court-martial. There would be no trial, no defense. Only execution. That night in the courtyard of the Bendela block, under the harsh glare of vehicle headlights, the conspirators faced a firing squad. Stauffenberg stood upright. When his turn came, he spoke. "Long live our sacred Germany." Shots rang out. By midnight, the central figures of Operation Valkyrie were dead. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The Gestapo arrested thousands, interrogations were relentless, names were extracted through torture, networks were unraveled. Those accused were brought before the People's Court, presided over by Roland Freisler. The trials were spectacles of humiliation and rage. Defendants were shouted down, mocked, and sentenced to death within minutes. Executions were filmed. Hitler ordered that they be slow. In the weeks that followed, nearly 5,000 people were executed in connection with the plot. Officers, civilians, even family members. The resistance was eradicated. The regime survived. But something had changed. For the first time, the myth of unanimous loyalty was broken. The world now knew that Germans had tried to kill Hitler. And within Germany, the knowledge lingered quietly. Even in a dictatorship built on obedience, choice had existed. And some had chosen to resist. The executions at the Bendela block did not end the story of Operation Valkyrie. They began its darkest chapter. Within hours of the failed coup, Adolf Hitler ordered a full reckoning. This time there would be no restraint, no quiet removals. The regime would answer betrayal with terror, and it would do so publicly. The goal was not justice. It was intimidation. The Gestapo moved with ruthless efficiency. Telephone records were seized, letters were examined, diaries were confiscated. Anyone who had spoken to the conspirators, even casually, became a suspect. Arrests came at night. Doors were kicked in, families were dragged from their homes. Children watched as fathers and mothers were taken away, often without explanation. Many would never return. Interrogations were merciless. Prisoners were beaten, starved, deprived of sleep. Some broke quickly, others endured in silence, but few could withstand the pressure indefinitely. The resistance networks, which had taken years to build, collapsed in days. Every confession led to another name. Every name to another execution. At the center of this judicial massacre stood the People's Court. Presided over by Roland Freisler, it was not a court in any meaningful sense. It was a stage. Defendants were denied proper clothing. Belts and suspenders were removed so trousers would fall during proceedings. Freisler screamed insults, interrupted answers, and mocked the accused relentlessly. The verdict was always the same: death. Executions were deliberately cruel. Many were hanged with thin wire or piano strings to prolong suffering. Hitler ordered that these deaths be filmed so he could watch them repeatedly. This was not punishment. It was vengeance. Yet even as the regime unleashed its fury, the war outside Germany's borders continued to deteriorate. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces pushed deeper into occupied territory. Cities fell one after another. German units retreated in disarray, often without orders, often without hope. In the West, Allied armies broke out of Normandy. Paris was liberated. By autumn, Germany's borders were under direct threat. The assassination attempt had failed, but it had not saved the regime. It had merely exposed its fragility. Within the military, trust was shattered. Hitler no longer believed in his generals. Officers were monitored closely. Promotions were scrutinized for political loyalty rather than competence. Decision-making became centralized to an extreme degree. The Führer now controlled operations down to the level of individual battalions. The result was paralysis. Among ordinary Germans, reactions were complex. Some were horrified by the attempt on Hitler's life. Others were quietly relieved that someone had tried. Many said nothing at all. Fear still ruled. But doubt had spread. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how much more it would suffer before the end. For the families of the conspirators, the consequences were devastating. Under the principle of Sippenhaft clan liability, relatives were punished for the actions of the accused, wives were imprisoned, children were taken away and given new names. The regime sought to erase not only the conspirators but their memory. And yet memory proved stubborn. As 1944 gave way to 1945, Germany descended into chaos. Cities lay in ruins, refugees flooded the roads, the front lines collapsed inward from every direction. In April, Soviet troops reached Berlin. Hitler retreated into his bunker beneath the capital. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life. The war in Europe ended days later. In the aftermath, Germany faced a reckoning unlike any in its history. The crimes of the regime were laid bare. The scale of destruction was undeniable. The question of responsibility loomed over everything. Who had supported Hitler? Who had resisted? Who had remained silent? At first, the men of July 20th were not celebrated. In the immediate post-war years, many Germans viewed them with suspicion. Some still called them traitors. Others dismissed their actions as too little, too late. But as decades passed, perspectives changed. The narrative shifted. Operation Valkyrie came to be understood not as a failed coup, but as a moral stand. It did not end the war. It did not save Germany. But it demonstrated that even within the heart of a totalitarian state, resistance was possible, and that obedience was not inevitable. When the war ended in May of 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Its cities were shattered, its infrastructure destroyed. Millions were dead, displaced, or imprisoned. The moral collapse of the Third Reich was now visible to the world in the form of camps, mass graves, and scorched earth. In this landscape of defeat, the question of resistance did not bring comfort. It brought discomfort. For many Germans, the men of July 20th were not heroes. They were reminders. Reminders that action had been possible, that obedience had not been universal, that silence had been a choice. In the first years after the war, public discussion of the assassination attempt was muted. Former Nazis dismissed the conspirators as traitors. Others argued that they had acted too late, when defeat was already inevitable. Some families of victims felt no sympathy. The wounds were too deep. Yet history does not stand still. As Germany rebuilt itself, first physically, then politically, it was forced to confront its past more directly. Trials, testimony, and documentation made denial impossible. The narrative of collective ignorance collapsed. And slowly, the meaning of July 20th began to change. Historians returned to the records. They examined letters, diaries, testimonies, and trial transcripts. They reconstructed conversations once whispered in fear. They traced networks that had been erased by terror. What emerged was not a myth of widespread resistance. It was something more complex. The resistance against Hitler had been small. Dangerously small. It had never represented the majority of Germans. Many conspirators were conservative nationalists, not Democrats. Some had supported Hitler early on. Others opposed him only when defeat became unavoidable. These facts complicated any attempt to turn them into simple heroes. But complexity did not erase courage. Claus von Stauffenberg in particular became a symbol not because he was flawless, but because he acted. He had benefited from the regime, he had served it, he had believed in parts of it. And then, when belief became impossible, he chose responsibility. That choice, made under conditions of total surveillance and certain death, is what history ultimately returned to. In the decades that followed, the Federal Republic of Germany gradually redefined July 20th as a moment of conscience. Memorials were erected, streets were renamed, the Bendela block became a site of remembrance. Every year on July 20th, new military recruits swear their oath not to a leader but to the Constitution. It is not accidental. It is a lesson written in blood. Operation Valkyrie did not fail because its participants lacked courage. It failed because authoritarian systems are resilient. They are built to survive betrayal. They thrive on fear, delay, and uncertainty. A single moved briefcase, a table leg, a moment of hesitation. History turned on details. But failure does not erase meaning. The men and women of the German resistance did not stop the war. They did not prevent catastrophe, but they left behind evidence that even under the most extreme conditions, moral choice remains possible. That evidence matters. The story of Operation Valkyrie is not a story of victory. It is a story of limits. The limits of obedience, the limits of loyalty, the limits of silence. It asks an uncomfortable question not only of Germans in 1944, but of anyone living under authority. At what point does duty become complicity? In the end, Adolf Hitler was not killed by resistance. He was defeated by overwhelming force and his own destruction. But the men of July 20th challenged something else, the idea that he was untouchable, inevitable, or unanimously supported. They shattered the illusion of total consent. Today, the Wolf's Lair lies in ruins. The Bendeleblock stands restored. What remains is not the bomb or the briefcase or the plan. What remains is the choice. And the knowledge that even in the darkest systems, history is shaped not only by those who rule, but by those who decide at great cost to say no.